ഹലോ, കേൾക്കാൻ പറ്റുന്നുണ്ടോ?
ഉണ്ട്.
ഓക്കെ, ഞാൻ എൻ്റെ സ്ക്രീൻ ഷെയർ ചെയ്യാം. പ്രസന്റേഷൻ കാണാൻ പറ്റുന്നില്ലേ?
ഉണ്ട്.
ഓക്കെ, അപ്പോൾ ഗുഡ് ഈവനിങ് എവറിബഡി. വെൽക്കം ടു ദിസ് സെഷൻ. Is there anyone in this meet who does not understand Malayalam? Can you please respond either in the chat box or by unmuting your mic? Okay, that's fine. So we'll continue in English. So welcome everyone to Let's Learn Python, day one of Let's Learn Python from EETIC community. And so in this session, we aim to cover the basics. So we have planned a half-an-hour session every day because, you and me all have exams, assignments, lab record, everything coming upon us, and it's really hectic. So one-day session or two-day session would be really difficult in this situation. So that's why we decided to keep half-an-hour sessions. So we'll move on to our introduction about Python. So Python is a high-level programming language. So before we continue, we need to know what a programming language is. So whichever programming language you take, it is used to communicate with a computer. So be it C, C++, Java, Python, anything, any programming language is basically used to communicate with a computer because a computer can only understand binary. So it's the job of this programming language to convert this code to binary. So it's a high-level programming language. So even though we say it's a high-level programming language, high-level does not mean it's difficult. High-level means that a computer cannot understand it. Only we can understand what we have typed. So the computer needs to further convert the Python code to binary in order so that the computer can understand it. So when we talk about programming language, there are two kinds of programming languages, or rather there are two approaches to programming. One is function-oriented programming and the other is object-oriented programming. I'll explain what this means. So for example, let's imagine that with Python, you can open the door of a fridge, okay? If you write some Python code, you can open the door of a fridge. I don't know if this is possible, but let's imagine that it's possible. So in a function-oriented approach, we would concentrate on the actions. Now, according to me, the two actions of opening a door are holding the handle and pulling to open. So those are the two actions you have to do. And so those are the two functions you have to do. So in a function-oriented programming approach, we focus on these two actions. However, Python is an object-oriented programming language, and an object-oriented approach to programming focuses on the objects present in the situation. So in this situation, opening a door, there are two objects present, hand and door. So when you write code in Python, we focus on those objects that are present in the problem or the scenario. So moving on, we'll talk about some history. And Python was created by Guido van Rossum. And this is Guido van Rossum. And he's a really big guy. He's worked at Google, Microsoft, Dropbox. He's a big shot. And an interesting thing is that Python is not named after a snake. It's named after Guido's favorite TV show. And the TV show is Monty Python's Flying Circus. I don't know if you've heard about it. I haven't heard about it, but apparently Guido liked it very much. He liked it so much that he named the programming language after that show. And now, one unique thing about Python, which is not related to programming at all, is that it has its own poem. And now I'll show you that poem. Okay, so this is the poem. The poem is called The Zen of Python. Now, you will imagine that I'm talking nonsense. Come on, like anybody can write poems, but this is actually an official poem. The thing is that if you code in Python, like we'll be talking about coding in Python in the coming days. We'll teach you everything about it, but there is a keyword called import. We type import in the code, and when we type import this poem comes up. So this is actually the official poem of Python. It's called the Zen of Python. It's written by Tim Peters. Now, Tim Peters is not a poet. He's a software engineer. He wrote this poem. And when you read this poem, you can see that this is not a really good poem. And that's because it is not just a poem. It is 19 guidelines for programmers. You can read through them whenever you want. You can just Google in the Zen of Python. Some of the lines are a bit confusing, but still, Python has its own poem. That's special. So anyway, moving on, there are like a lot of programming languages, and Python is not really new. I mean, it was invented in 1991. It was, it's not that new. It's around 30 years old. So why Python after all these years? Still, why Python? It's simple and powerful, and I everyone says about everything. Like whatever it is, Java is simple, Java is powerful, but Python is actually even more simple and even more powerful. And another great thing about Python is that whichever OS you have, Python runs in a similar manner. Now, I don't know how many of you study coding in college. Like, if there are computer science students in this Google Meet, you'll know that when you write code for an assignment, when you have to code for an assignment, obviously you don't always do it on your own. You have to copy from your friends. Naturally, yes. So the thing is, if you have a Windows machine and if your friend has a Linux machine, okay, now you need to copy code from your friend because you have to submit it tomorrow. And so you can just take that code and run it on your machine. Python runs in a similar manner. It doesn't really differ in whether you use Windows or Linux or whatever you use. So another great thing about Python is it has a big, great, and up-to-date documentation. So what exactly is documentation? Documentation is when everything about this programming language. Documentation is everything about it, all about the code, how Python works. Everything about Python is detailed in this documentation, and you can find this documentation in Python's official website. I'll show you that documentation later. And now the greatest advantage, the most important advantage is it's free and it's open source. Now it's free, so that is a huge plus point. And not all programming languages are free. A lot of them are actually paid. You may use it freely, but it's not actually free. You have to buy them. Now, open source means that you can freely use and modify it, which means you can take this programming language Python and you can modify it to make another version. So that is why we use Python after all these years. The Python developers have been updating and constantly modifying the Python code so that it becomes easier and more convenient over the years. And right now, Python is much more simple than when it started. In 1991, Python was not so simple as this. Python was not so powerful as this. And right now, Python is probably the simplest and most powerful programming language only because it's open source. Anybody can modify it, and that's why Python releases versions regularly. Right now, the version that's running is Python 3.9. They release versions every once in a while, and so we can download and install it and use it. And we'll be covering the installation and everything. So it's free, so it has a huge number of users. And because it has a huge number of users, Python has a large developer community. Now, developers are the people whom I referred to before, who use it, modify it, and update it to release new versions. Now, that's all really great. Now, Python is very simple. It's very powerful. Python is actually useful? Well, yes, it is. Python is used everywhere. Whether you want to make a website or you want to make a video game, whether you want to do machine learning, everywhere Python is used. And this pic, you can ignore this. This is actually some great editing work that I did. Uh, it's really good, right? Yeah, I know. Uh, okay, so Python is used in a variety of fields, and why is that? It's because Python is open source. Like I told you, anybody can take Python and modify it. So anyone can make a Python library. Now, what is a library? Now, when you think about a library, you think about a lot of books arranged in a certain order, collection of books. And similarly, software libraries are collections of modules, and modules are bundles of code. Now, these modules can be used in many programs. So, the advantage is that you don't really have to take this code and you don't have to write this code all over again. You can just import a library into your program and use that library instead of writing the whole code again. And this is actually very useful. It makes programming easier, and libraries are used in a whole lot of different applications, as you can see in this picture. These are just 6 libraries: Pandas, TensorFlow, Scikit-learn, OpenCV, NumPy, PyTorch. The names are a bit weird, but they're a bit frightening, but they're just libraries. They're all used for different applications. You can import these libraries into your program and actually use them in whatever way you need. And so these 6 libraries that I have shown are used in data science and machine learning. Um, but there are other libraries that are used in a whole lot of different applications as well. Apart from libraries, there are other things we can build with Python, and that is a framework. Framework is different from a library. It provides a platform for developing different applications. I mean, it actually kind of provides a launch pad. Actually, if you can write code on the framework so that it becomes easier for you to develop something. Now, I know this sounds confusing, but there isn't really any simpler way to describe this. It makes it really convenient for the user to develop an application because it does a lot of work by itself. So you can see the names of 2 frameworks here, Django and Flask. Now these frameworks are used for developing web websites and mobile apps. You can develop them using these libraries. So the advantage is that it takes care of a lot of very small functions that otherwise you would have had to write these functions on your own. But frameworks make it easier. They write these functions. They have all the implementations on their own. So it takes care of the low level functionality, all the basic things it takes care of by itself. So that's about Python framework. So um, that's it for the introduction. So before we move on, does anybody have any doubts? I mean, I know this is an intro session, but if anybody has any doubts, please feel free to put them in the chat box or unmute your mic. Okay, so I'm guessing no doubts. So we'll move on to the real work. Now, if it's possible, please open this website, www.python.org. I'll stop sharing and share this website with you. Just a second. Okay, so I hope this website is visible. This is the official Python website, and this is you can download Python from this. Now, to download Python, you can go to downloads, and as you can see, Python is available for a whole lot of different versions. For example, it has a different version for Windows, something different for Mac OS, and for other platforms. So if you have a Windows machine, please download for Windows. If you have a MacBook or an iMac, download Python for Mac OS. And if you have something else, go to other platforms. So before we install it, I will show you Python documentation. This is the Python documentation I was talking about earlier. This is everything about Python, including what's new in Python 3.10 tutorial. You can learn Python with this documentation. You can learn about installing Python modules, libraries, everything, setup and usage. You can learn about installing Python and the complete table of contents, history and license of Python, copyright of Python, and it has all the information you need about Python. That's basically what documentation does. So we'll go back, and if you have Windows, now I have Windows on my laptop, so I have downloaded Python 3.10.2. That's the latest version that of Python. So when you download that, you will get an installer file. This is the installer file. That's Yeah. So this is you've downloaded Python now, and now you have to install it into your computer. Now to install it, click on customize installation. Now you have a lot of options here. This is a checkbox for documentation. So I showed you the entire documentation. So if you want to check something on the documentation, it's really hard to, open your browser, type in python.org and go to docs and find whatever you want. So what Python does is it installs the entire documentation file into your computer so that you can refer to it inside that file. So that's really a useful thing to do. And this is pip. And the next checkbox is for pip. Now pip is an application in Python which can download and install other Python packages. So I talked about other packages that you can import into your program and use instead of writing that code all over again. So the tool you use that for that is pip. Now that is a something advanced topic which we will not be covering, but you can check that in Google how to install other Python packages. Now we have something called idle. Idle is where you code in Python. If you download and install Python, you can code in something called idle, and idle stands for Integrated Development Environment. And then you have next. Click on next, and then you have some other different checkboxes. And something important is add Python to environment variables. This is a really important checkbox. Don't forget to check this. It'll be automatically checked, but don't uncheck this. And what this does is everything that is installed into your computer has to be given a path, and the computer has to know that this compiler or this program exists in your computer, and that is why you have to add your program path to the environment variable of the system. So that sounds complicated, but if you check this box, you don't really have to do anything more. Now, below this, you can see the customize install location. This is where all the files of Python will go. Now, in my case, it's in the C directory in the folder program files. It'll create a new folder called Python 310. And that is where all the files of Python will be stored. Now, you can change it by clicking on browse. And then when you click on install, it will be installed. Now, that's it about installing Python. So we talked about a whole lot of applications of Python, installation of Python, history of Python, libraries, and most importantly, why we should study Python after all these years. Why is Python so important? So that is actually it for today. If you have any doubts, please ask, because it's really important to clear up your doubts as we go on with the session. And so we've distributed these sessions over a few days so that you can understand what is taught in each day and come for the next session. So that's why we did that. So if you have any doubts, please ask. Either unmute your mic or put it in the chat box.
പിന്നെ ഡൗട്ട്സ് ഇംഗ്ലീഷിൽ തന്നെ ചോദിക്കണമല്ലോ കേട്ടോ, നിങ്ങളെ ലാംഗ്വേജ് ചോദിക്കാം, മലയാളം ചോദിക്കാനവർക്ക് അങ്ങനെ ചോദിക്കാം.
Okay, so if there are no doubts, we can wind up for today. Bilal, എന്തെങ്കിലും പറയാനുണ്ടോ?
ആർക്കും ഡൗട്ട്സ് ഒന്നും ഇല്ലേ?
ഹലോ
ഹലോ
സാർ, ഈ അർഡിനോ സോഫ്റ്റ്വെയറും പൈത്തണുമായിട്ട് എന്തെങ്കിലും റിലേഷൻ ഉണ്ടോ?
അർഡുനോ കോഡ് ചെയ്യുന്നത് പൈത്തണിലല്ല. പിന്നെ കൂടുതൽ ഇൻഫർമേഷൻ വേണമെങ്കിൽ ഞാനൊന്ന് നോക്കിയിട്ട് പറയാം.
ശരിക്കും നമുക്ക് ആർഡിനോ കോഡ് ചെയ്യുന്നത് പൈത്തണിലല്ല, ബട്ട് നമുക്ക് ആർഡിനോയും പൈത്തണും യൂസ് ചെയ്ത് ഓപ്പൺ സി ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റും. പൈത്തൺ നമുക്ക് ആർഡിനോയിൽ ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റും, ബട്ട് കുറച്ച് ഡിഫിക്കൽട്ടാണ് അത് ചെയ്യാൻ വേണ്ടിയിട്ട്. മറ്റേ പോലെ ഐഡിയ യൂസ് ചെയ്യുന്ന അത്ര എളുപ്പമല്ല, കുറച്ചൊരു പണിയാണ്, ബട്ട് ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റും, ചെയ്തിട്ടുണ്ട്.